on with it.
Great to have you all here. And it's particularly great and pleasurable to have our speaker today. And I'll tell you about her in a minute. We have, again, a great mix of students, professors, hangers-on, everything we can possibly have. And it's perfect for you, Carey. Our speaker today in the seminar is Carey Shea. Carey worked with me for how many years?
7.
7? When I was in New York, we were
7 years, 4 months.
when we were both at the Surgeon Foundation. Carey did, her specialty was community revitalization and essentially rebuilding communities. And left Surgeon and went briefly to Habitat for Humanity to be COO in New York. And then was recruited by Rockefeller Foundation to essentially go down, well, you will probably tell the story in greater detail, but to go down and take care of all the money that was going to start to flood into New Orleans after Katrina came through. And has been there on and off, but mostly on since then, and deeply engaged in not only helping out where she could, but also understanding a very unique culture and a very unique set of politics, unique for the United States and unique in the world. So I asked Carey if she would come and talk with folks who would be interested in the subject, and you are. So I'm very glad to welcome you, and we're going to do what we usually do, which is start at some point in the room and say, please introduce yourselves, where you're from, and one more thing, which is if you have had experience of some kind, knowledge with, involvement with, lived in New Orleans, why don't you just make a sentence reference to that too, so Carey will have some contextual frame for it. So we're going to start with the young man on my left.
The hanger-on who arises by birth from New Orleans, who had the great good fortune of working in a field that Carey was so expert in, and working with Surgeon in a period that I was at Knight Foundation. I'm at the University of North Carolina now. My family had a music store in New Orleans for about 5 generations, called Worlines for Music. It was on Canal Street, laterally it was in many places in the South as well as in New Orleans. It's now in bankruptcy, but that's another story. The one thing that struck it as being important for much of its post-Civil War period was to have hanging on the wall in a place which now is called the Something Cafe. What we said was the original version of Dixie. And we kept it up there proudly until about 1965, when it suddenly seemed obvious that wasn't a great idea. In the changing South of our time, it came down just as well because it was a lie. The old minstrel man had sold his original version of Dixie to about 5 publishing houses across the country, and ours was one of the latter of those things. New Orleans is, in fact, a place that I knew better than any place for my first 20-something years. My first 2 newspaper jobs were down there for newspapers that no longer exist. And I went there, as some people would go to New York, I would go to New Orleans. I care about it a great deal.
Great, thank you.
My name is Suzanne Sploot, and I'm here by virtue of being the wife of Edward. But I'm also really here because my parents met in New Orleans.
Oh dear.
Oh, Pat,
My name is, you want my whole name?
every bit.
Patricia Sue Miriam Murphy Darian Carter. And Howie is my husband, and that was my present for him on his birthday.
Finally
Enjoyed
call
the
herself
train.
Carter.
I don't know much about New Orleans in terms of living there. I do know that Hotting's mother maintained a lovely the last really genteel person. I love him.
Thank
Is
you.
that right, Gretchen?
Yeah.
And a very well-known historic preservationist.
Her mother was the one who preserved the French Quarter.
Francis?
Francis Letham. I'm the director of the Duke Center for International Development. And professionally, I'm not related to the audience.
Yes?
I'm Charlotte Williams and my husband John, and we are walk-ins. We're just civilians in Chapel Hill, but have a friend that's in the School of Public Policy that told me of the talk, and I grew up in Louisiana and have close ties to New Orleans. I remember the New Orleans Music Store, and New Orleans is where we went for every special occasion. My sister still has a home in New Orleans, and I care deeply about what happens to New Orleans.
Great. Want to add anything?
I don't think I can add much more than that.
Okay, great. Please.
Hi, my name is Ashley Brown. I'm a third-year PhD student here at the Sanford School. I'm originally from New Orleans. My senior thesis in college was on New Orleans. I'm the coordinator of our Duke Engage New Orleans program. So yeah, of course I'd be able to talk.
You should be giving the talk.
Okay.
I'm Ted Fisk, and I'm another hanger-on, and I write about education.
Nice to meet you.
My name is Dana Patel. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student, and while I don't have personal ties to New Orleans, I recently finished a presentation on kind of the inability of the government of New Orleans to partner with Walmart during the Hurricane Katrina crisis. And so I come at it kind of from the public policy and fundraising partnerships perspective, and given that this is a foundation interest group, I thought what a great perspective to add the Rockefeller Foundation and what you've done. So
I'm Marty Martin. I'm an attorney in private practice that works with nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations. And my only experience with New Orleans was a number of years ago when I went down for a 4-day board meeting with the National Alzheimer's Association. And had a wonderful experience with a senior board member who took us to Antoine's. He was a wine connoisseur and he had a corporate credit card.
I know what to do with that one.
Just bask in the glow.
my name is Grace. I'm the first year public policy student at Walter Group Business School. I have never been to New Orleans. I'd love to at some point. I am interested in housing policy and public-private partnerships.
Terrific.
My name is Sarah Rosenberg. I'm a first year MFP student like Grace, and I'm from Chapel Hill. My name is Jen Preston. I'm also a first year public policy student just interested in learning more about it.
I'm Kristen Goss. I'm on the faculty here at Stanford School, and I guess my closest connection is one of my dear friends is one of the leaders of the Historic New Orleans Coalition.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, terrific.
Sure. Right.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
My name is Brent Palmer, and I'm just a person kind of from Durham. My brother does like Habitat for Humanity and things like that, so I haven't been really active in trying to help the community, and this way I figure if I kind of in the country, hopefully eventually, but I'm trying to find myself in the right place in the right situation to do that.
Good.
Great.
I'm Sarah Burdick from the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, and I have never been to Louisiana.
I'm Joel Huber. I'm in the faculty of the business school.
I'm Ginger Saul. I'm on the boards of CARE and WWF, and my 93-year-old father grew up in the Bogacheva Swamp.
Oh, my goodness.
And during the Depression, he worked as a longshoreman in New Orleans for $10 a day, and lucky to get a stock of bananas, and worked his way through Mississippi State as an engineer. And years later, my brother graduated from Tulane as an electrical engineer.
Carey, I'm with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. I lived in New Orleans from 93 to 99, about 2 blocks from the Katrina Theater.
Okay.
And my children were born there.
Lovely.
So I have some attachment to New Orleans.
I'm Joel McFarland. I'm a first-year MFP student. I'm Patrick Sable. I'm also a first-year MPP student, and after Katrina, I went down with some friends and we did rebuilding there for a couple weeks.
With what organization?
We started off with Opportunity Rocks, which was John Edwards' effort down there, and we managed to stick around for a little longer.
Great.
That was pre-scandal.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I'm Ariel Hayes, and I'm also a first-year master's student here.
Great.
Let me add one thing.
Yeah,
Because
please.
The work you're doing, I'm being disingenuous. I'm with two organizations that work on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in New Orleans. One is the Enterprise Corporation of the Delta and Bill Bynum, and the other one is one you don't know, but it's one that's based over there that arose from some of Knight Foundation's work. We did along the same thing. So that's all I'm interested in.
Terrific. Well, thank you all very much. I didn't know that I would have such a well-informed audience, and really I hope that you're not an audience, because I'd like this to be very much a discussion. There is a lot to talk about, and I really had to sort of pick and choose as to what I was going to speak about, because so much has gone on in the last 4 years in New Orleans that it's hard to know how to really focus this. I'd really be very happy if any of you had questions during the discussion to just come out with it. I've prepared some notes and sort of have a general discussion that I want to give, but I'm much more happy to get you information you're interested in than just spew my ideas out to you. So feel free to jump in. As all of you know, on August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina, which was really only a Category 4 hurricane, formed out in the Gulf Coast and hit land in Burris, Louisiana, which is hundreds of miles away from New Orleans. Down at the very end of the Mississippi River where it spills out into the Gulf Coast, into the Gulf of Mexico, and moved up the southeast side of New Orleans and the western edge of Mississippi, causing one of the worst disasters in the history of the United States. The storm surges, which are the big walls of water that move with a hurricane, pushed up various old shipping routes that had been dug to make for quicker transport from the interior states down to the Gulf of Mexico quicker than the Mississippi River could provide. And the water and the storm surges pushed up these old shipping routes and into the city of New Orleans, where they overwhelmed the interior levee system in the city. The city is protected by levees not only along the Mississippi River, which runs sort of on the southern border of the city, but on the northern edge of the city too, where Lake Pontchartrain sits, and where there are literally canals that run from the lake into the city, or really from the city into the lake, that constantly, even when it is not raining in New Orleans, pump water out of the city of New Orleans to keep it a dry city. And the levees along these shipping routes along Lake Pontchartrain and along these canals, these pumping canals, breached. They broke, and some of them topped. Water spilled over the tops of them. And the city of New Orleans filled like a bowl with water. 80% of the city by the following day was submerged with water, salt water, which was particularly damaging, and remained that way for several weeks while the pumping stations were brought back online, while they were unclogged, while power was restored, while the machinery was fixed, and eventually the city was able to be pumped dry again. And the damage that was done in the city of New Orleans was, of course, in the billions of dollars. But Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi also sustained damage, combined damage in the literally trillions of dollars. 1,600 people in the region died, and 1,000 people in the city of New Orleans died from, oddly enough, either too much water, drowning, or not enough water, dehydration, in the days that followed, when many people waited on their roofs and in their attics to be rescued. Some people would say that the real tragedy occurred in the 5 days after the storm, when all of the world watched as one of the most wealthy and powerful nations failed to rescue some of its most vulnerable citizens from a relatively small and easy to access area. And I would say that it was this combination of the physical disaster coupled with the failed initial response that was televised 24 hours a day for 5 days and beyond, that ignited an unprecedented mobilization of philanthropic and volunteer resources that followed. I think that had the response been swift, I don't think that there would have been quite the response that there was. But I think that the combination was what really fueled the amazing response to this horrible tragedy. Unlike probably most of you and most of my friends and colleagues, I kind of missed the whole thing. I had been in my home in New York City. I had been working, as Ed said, at Habitat for Humanity. It was Labor Day weekend, and I was going to go up to the Catskill Mountains. And a friend of mine, I never watch TV in the morning, and a friend of mine was at the house, and she had turned on the television in the kitchen, and she said, oh, it looks like they're going to have a hurricane in New Orleans. And she said, people are going over to the Superdome to ride out the storm. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to miss it. I bet that's going to be a party. And this was my response, because for most people, New Orleans means a good time. And if you get a bunch of New Orleanians together for a hurricane, what are they going to do? They're going to throw a party. And I jumped in my car and I drove to the mountains, where I had no telephone and no cell phone and no television. And 3 days or so later, I went to an auto parts store to get a piece for my car. And I walked in, and the guy was there, and the dog was sitting there on the chair, and there was a TV up in the corner of the room, and there were some people on their roofs of these houses surrounded by water. And I said to the auto parts guy, where's that? And he said, New Orleans. And I said, but that was days ago. And he said, they've been sitting up there for days. And I think my response was sort of like everybody else's response, which is, where's the cavalry? You know, where's help? What's going on? Why are there Americans who are in a hurricane 3 days ago sitting on the roofs of their houses waiting for help? And it wasn't until I was actually working in New Orleans and had moved down there to participate in the recovery, and Spike Lee came to town and debuted his documentary, When the Levees Broke, which Rockefeller Foundation had actually played a role in financing the very end of it. It was an HBO production, and Rockefeller paid for Spike to finish the film and for a curriculum for high school and college students to learn about the hurricane and the disaster through this film, did I really see the days after the storm mapped out, day 1, day 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the real rescue occurring. Since then, I've met hundreds of people who were actually there during the storm and survived it, and I'm always a little amazed. I was in New Orleans just 2 weeks ago and was talking to a guy about planting some trees out in his house because the salt water killed so many of the trees in New Orleans. And he was an old guy, and he mentioned to me that he had stayed during the storm because his 76-year-old uncle wasn't able to leave, and the water rose, and he ran to his garage, he grabbed an axe, he cut a hole, he went up into his attic and then cut a hole through his roof, and he and his uncle spent 3 days between the roof and the attic waiting for help, and that the Red Cross finally picked him off the roof in a helicopter. So you meet these people every day, so it's a very sort of real history that's embodied now in these folks, and they are able to tell the story of what happened. I don't want to spend too much time on that. You could probably talk much better as to the immediate crisis and the sort of failures that happened immediately after the storm. But I want to talk about what happened a little bit later, a different stage in the process, because it was really, philanthropy doesn't come in immediately after a storm. People now believe that there are essentially 3 stages of response after a disaster. The first stage is the rescue phase. And the rescue is when the Red Cross and FEMA and so forth come in. And philanthropy does support the Red Cross and other disaster organizations and first responder organizations, but it's primarily corporate philanthropy that writes big checks for those folks and those organizations. And that all happens within days after a disaster. The second phase in disaster relief or disaster response is the actual relief effort. And that's when people, the victims of the disaster now have been brought to a safe place, and they're connected with food and with temporary shelter, eventually permanent shelter. Their medications are, re-prescribed and brought to them, and people who have dialysis and so forth. So it's sort of a stabilization process and getting people their basic needs met. And that happens also with the Red Cross and FEMA, but you'll see at that point a lot of religious organizations have become very good at sort of mobilizing during the disaster relief phase and providing food and shelter, and religious organizations from all over the United States came down to the Gulf Coast and set up tents and big camps and provided food for weeks and weeks as people were being connected to social services and eventually filtered out of the shelters. And then the third phase is what we call the recovery phase. And that begins, depending on the scope of the disaster, I would say anywhere between 6 months and a year after the disaster. And it's in this recovery phase where we really saw philanthropy step up and become engaged. I divide the recovery phase into sort of an early stage and then a later stage. In the early stage, you see from both philanthropy and government a lot of assessment going on. People have to find out, what's the situation down there? What's the situation in the disaster area? And in New Orleans, it was particularly challenging because philanthropy had not, prior to the storm, been fully engaged in New Orleans. Even though it was a world famous city and it was a city that people loved, it was not a city that for the most part philanthropists felt comfortable operating in. And you smile when I say that. Is there something you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, nothing in particular, but it's just the culture of New Orleans makes everything difficult. The traditional culture of New Orleans. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that's a fair assessment. Prior to the storm, there were a lot of arts funders in New Orleans.
Not enough.
Not enough considering the wealth
No,
of...
I mean, actually, that was the starved aspect of the life as well in New Orleans, to be perfectly honest. But they were at least funded somewhat, nothing else was funded.
Right, right. But there are very few community development funders down there. I was involved as a community development funder nationally and in my entire, 7, 8 years, and then really only made one grant in New Orleans, and it was one that I had made with, both with fingers crossed on both hands. So you had a situation where you didn't have a lot of funders who knew the city well, and now they needed to understand who was down there and what was going on down there because they wanted to connect with the nonprofit community in New Orleans. So different foundations approached it different ways. A lot of foundations hired consultants and sent them down there or sent down program staff who kind of surveyed the area, met with groups, so on and so forth. The first stop for most of these folks was the local community foundation in New Orleans. And the community foundation had been around for a really long time. Unfortunately, it was a very small foundation that had primarily focused on donor services. It was very good at getting wealthy families to open up funds within the foundation and to help manage those funds, but it had not been a real proactive organization. It ran very few of its own programs, and it gave away very little money each year. And so I think that a lot of the national foundations and other and corporate foundations that came to New Orleans were a bit surprised when they got down to New Orleans and saw that it was a relatively small community foundation, and that there was a very limited amount of staff down there to help them engage in grant making. In the case of the Rockefeller Foundation, the number 2 person at the Rockefeller Foundation after the storm got on a plane and went down to New Orleans for a week. And I always found this very interesting because as far as I know, no other foundations really sent their, top dogs down there. And I think part of the reason this happened was that Rockefeller had gone through a transformation and they had very little staff, and so there were very few people who could go down. But I think that Rockefeller knew that they wanted to make a relatively large commitment, and they really felt that they didn't want to hear about the city through someone else. So Darren Walker went down to New Orleans and took a look around. What I told Ed earlier in the day, what was particularly interesting about this was that not only did Rockefeller get sort of firsthand information by sending Darren down there, but the city of New Orleans knew that it had been visited by Rockefeller Foundation. So it wasn't a consultant who worked on behalf of, or, the senior vice president of Rockefeller had come to New Orleans and had spent a week there trying to assess the situation. And this was unprecedented, and everyone knew that Darren had been there. Word eventually got back up to Baton Rouge, and the governor sent 2 people to the Rockefeller Foundation to speak with Darren Walker and with the president, Judith Rodin of the Rockefeller Foundation. And they knew that Rockefeller was looking for a way to invest in the recovery. The foundation had already made a number of medium-sized grants, a few $100,000 here and there, to a number of organizations in New Orleans, the NAACP, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the Enterprise Foundation, and the Greater New Orleans Foundation, but was looking to make a big and very strategic investment. And two people came from the Louisiana Recovery Authority, which was a body set up to manage the federal funds that would come to the state for the recovery, and it was set up by the governor. And they came to Rockefeller, and they basically said that funding to the city of New Orleans, federal funding to the city of New Orleans, was being held up because the city of New Orleans did not have a recovery plan in place that was acceptable to the federal government. And typically, in these disaster situations, municipalities put together a plan that is a sort of standard FEMA recovery plan where they say, here's what existed, here's the value of what existed, here's what got damaged, here's the cost of bringing whatever was damaged back to its pre-disaster level. So, you know, we had streets, they were in very good condition, now they're damaged. To get them back to the condition that they were, we would need this. And typically, these so-called plans are sort of a laundry list of everything that's been damaged, how much it will cost to repair. They submit it to Washington. Everybody jostles and dukes and negotiates and twists arms. Prices are set, and FEMA payments begin to flow. What happened to New Orleans, obviously, was going to require much more than sort of a laundry list of damaged items, because not only were buildings damaged, entire systems were damaged, and the population was so greatly altered that rebuilding the city to the state and condition that it was in prior to the storm didn't really make sense. The governor had already gone to Washington and had been able to secure some funding for the rebuilding, but really wanted significantly more. And when she returned to Washington the second time, she was told, we don't have a sense of what you're doing. You know, we have some lists. The FEMA plan is incomplete. The mayor seems to be doing his own thing. The governor is involved in this planning process, but you know, you're not involved with the city. We need something that really maps out what you want to do and how much this whole thing is going to cost, and the steps that you're going to take to implement this over the next 10 years. So the governor who had a very, very bad relationship with the mayor. The mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, is a Democrat, and the governor at the time, Kathleen Blanco, was a Democrat, and Mayor Nagin had not supported her when she ran for election against Bobby Jindal, who's now the governor of Louisiana, a Republican. And so this had all happened before the storm, so the relationship between the two of them wasn't so good to begin with. During the storm, it became even more tense, and even more so in the days that followed. And it got to the point where it was said that the two of them couldn't be alone in a room together for more than 5 minutes without fighting. So they were not able to work together. Mayor Nagin set out to put together his own plan. And he worked with the Urban Land Institute, a trade association of developers, to put together this plan. And they actually, and I recommend strongly that you take a look at it. You can find it on the internet. It was put together by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, and it was put together in just less than 30 days, and it was sort of a general plan that gave a bird's eye view and some sort of general principles on how the city of New Orleans should be redeveloped. I think it's a tremendous plan, and really everything that every plan since the Bring New Orleans Back Commission plan has recommended the same things. The Bring New Orleans Back Commission, however, made a critical mistake in that they put together a map that recommended that certain areas of the city be returned to green space because they were so far below sea level and because they had flooded so badly that the recommendation was that they not be redeveloped. And they issued this map with these big green dots in areas that they felt should be returned to nature or be used for drainage. And the Times-Picayune, the local newspaper, got a hold of that map and put it on the front page in color for all New Orleanians to see. And if folks were worried that the hurricane was going to be used as a way from preventing them, as a way to prevent them from returning, this map confirmed it for a lot of them. So you had folks who had already heard that the storm was God's way of cleaning up a city that they had tried to clean up for years, and suddenly this map was issued. And for a lot of folks, that was all they needed to see. And the city held a public hearing on the plan. They had held a number of public hearings prior to this on various elements of the plan and had rented a room at the convention center that could hold 700 people, and about 20 or 30 people would show up for each one of these sessions. When this map was issued and the public hearing was held, it was standing room only. And people were furious. And the mayor responded by dissolving the planning committee for the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, saying that the building department would be issuing building permits at no cost to anybody who wanted them. All parts of New Orleans were open for redevelopment, and that the market would decide where redevelopment would happen. So the mayor, in a matter of 24 hours, pretty much abandoned land use planning in the post-disaster phase. So the governor went to the Rockefeller Foundation and asked the Rockefeller Foundation, the governor's staff people, and said if they would in fact help pay for a recovery plan. And if not only would they help pay for this recovery plan, but if they would help shepherd this thing through, because the city was having a hard time coming up with the funds to pay for the plan and the ability to actually do the plan. So the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to do this and set aside $3.5 million, figuring that the plan was going to cost about $7 million to complete. And they had originally thought that they would hire a consultant to sort of help this thing along while they were making this big grant. Darren heard that I was interested in moving to New Orleans and working on the recovery, and he called me up and asked me if I would be interested in this consulting position. And I said, well, not really, that I intended to move to New Orleans with my husband, who was the Assistant Commissioner of Housing Policy in the city of New York, and that we were both, looking to get full-time jobs in New Orleans where we could really participate in the recovery. And so Darren went back to Judith Roden. They had a discussion about this, and they decided that, in fact, this should be what they do, and that they would hire a full-time person and send her down there and have her do the plan. It's very interesting because if you read the evaluation that Rockefeller commissioned about their work, this now is one of the sort of key findings, that when a foundation is engaged in a big project after, in response to a disaster, that a staff person should be should be deployed to that area and should become a resident and live there full time during the course of the grant making. But it was really sort of by accident that this came about. So I went down there and
just
oh, please, yeah.
Carey owns, you don't anymore, I think, but owned a house in New Orleans and knew New Orleans and had lived in New Orleans. And your mother was living in the house at the time. Is that right?
She had lived there before, yeah.
She lived there before. So where?
In the Bywater.
So Carey not only had the background professionally, but she really understood the city, and that was a huge plus as well.
Right. I knew the city and I loved the city, but I have to say, when I went in, they had me go in and interview with Judith Rodin, and I was a little intimidated because I had heard about Judith Rodin, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, and you know, I don't have Rockefeller level credentials. I have a BA from an alternative college in Western Massachusetts. And I had spent a lot of time doing community development work and of course worked for Ed Skloot. And, I went in and I had, you know, made real wide margins on my resume so I could stretch it out over 2 pages. And met with Judith Rodin, and she had my resume in her hand, and she sort of waved it around a little bit, and she said, all of this is good. She said, but what I'm really interested in is this last sentence here on your resume. What is this? And I had written under education, which is always a challenging spot on my resume for me, that I was currently enrolled in a project management certificate program at the General Society for Mechanics and Tradesmen in New York City. And Judith said, you know, what is this? And I said, well, you know, I'm very interested in project management, and I'm an owner's rep, and, you know, that kind of, you know, work. And she said, you're our owner's rep. She said, you're not a program officer, you're not our planner, you're our owner's rep in New Orleans. This is a project, and I need you to get this project done. You have 1 year. And, and the interview was pretty much over, and off I went down to New Orleans. And I think Judith, you know, Judith Rodin, for those of you who don't know, used to be the president of the University of Pennsylvania. And she is largely responsible for redeveloping that area in Philadelphia around the university that had gone through very bad times and had been very disinvested and is now a really thriving area. And, you know, while other people see Judith as an intellectual and academic and so forth, you know, she had always been, in my book, just a stellar developer. I think she's a rock star when it comes to development, and she knew immediately what I was talking about when I said owner's rep, and I think that was exactly the right way to describe the role that I played. I recently had a conversation with someone from a big foundation in the Midwest who's going to be involved in Detroit. And they said, we want to do a plan like the recovery plan that Rockefeller did with the city of New Orleans. And she said, and you know, we know that people aren't coming back to Detroit, and the city's going to have to shrink, and people are going to have to move, and certain parts of the city are going to have to be decommissioned, and maybe it's going to be urban land. And she sort of described the outcome of the plan that hadn't been done yet because they wanted to have a deep citizen involvement in the planning process. And I said to her, it's very important that the foundation that's paying for the plan doesn't prescribe the outcome of the plan. And I think that I dropped out of planning school after 1 year. They made me take statistics. You were starting to say how tough statistics are. And so I went to planning school for a year at the Pratt Institute, and then they made me take statistics, and I decided planning wasn't for me. So there was no danger of me dabbling too deeply in the planning. And Rockefeller, when they made this giant investment in the planning process, they really limited they held back. They said, we want to make sure that the plan is one that is shaped by the people. We want to make sure there's very heavy participation in putting together this plan. They said, we want to make sure that it addresses the needs of the poor and vulnerable, but then it stopped. And I think that there were a lot of people at Rockefeller who knew what they wanted the plan to actually say, but never acted in a way or to impose their vision of what the plan outcome should be on the plan itself. So I was really sent down there just to manage the process and to make sure the plan got done, but I was not there to influence the plan. So we did do the plan. We did not do it in a year. We did it in a year and a day. My husband thinks I'm a failure because I couldn't even get the plan done in a year. It involved literally thousands of people. And that was very, very challenging to get thousands of people involved. What we initially did was hire a sort of master planner to oversee and design the whole planning process, and then hired teams of planners from across the country to actually do planning in the neighborhoods. But we felt it was very important to have what we called some community congresses, where we would try and bring together people from all over the city of New Orleans. And we had hired a local communications firm to help organize and get the word out so we could get people to this first planning effort. And we rented the convention center and set out tables and chairs for literally to accommodate 2,000 people. And at our very first Congress, only about a quarter of the chairs were filled. And we had done during the planning event, this Congress, a poll was taken to kind of figure out who was in the room. And the Congress was put on by America Speaks. They helped facilitate it. And they have this cool technology where just like with a TV remote, you can vote. And it tabulates very quickly, and then the results pop up on this giant screen. And so some of the first information that they gathered from the crowd was demographic information, information on race and information on income. And at this first Congress, the majority of the people in the room were white, and the majority of the people in the room were above the median income for the city of New Orleans. And a woman sitting next to me said, I can see tomorrow's headline, Rich Whites Plan the Future of New Orleans. And she wasn't far off. That's exactly what the headline said. And I went back to New York right after this event, and I said, we can hire the best planners in the world, We can spout out all we want to spout out about equity and inclusion and participation, but unless we get people to these congresses and their voices are heard, we will not produce a plan that is a valid plan that will be acceptable to and accepted by the city of New Orleans. And we went out and we raised close to another $4 million and got rid of our local communications team and brought in America Speaks. And there, we called up other foundations who we knew who were really concerned. The Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a number of them. And they chipped in because they were concerned too. And the two subsequent community congresses had thousands of people there, and the demographics reflected the demographics of the city, which were, the city had pre-Katrina been 67% African American, and a largely poor city. And so we were able to do that. By the time we finished the plan, it had officially been called the Unified New Orleans Plan. And it was called the Unified New Orleans Plan because there had been a number of planning efforts sort of happening organically, one funded by the city council for a portion of the city, while the before and then while the Unified New Orleans Plan was happening. And we felt that it was very important that the Unified New Orleans Plan sort of bring all these plans into the larger plan. By the end of the process, a journalist at the Times-Picayune wrote a column and referred to the plan as the People's Plan. And this really got taken up, and people refer to it as the People's Plan because by the end, thousands of people had participated in this planning process. And I think that as far as planning is concerned, the thing that I learned from this whole process is that plan is much more important as a verb than as a noun. And in the recovery, in the post-disaster environment, people are so angry and so scared, and there are so many rumors flying around, and there were such horrible statements made that were particularly threatening to African Americans in New Orleans, and people felt so vulnerable, and it was the planning process itself was far more important as a way to bring people together to, even though some of them were literally living in tents on lots where their houses used to be, they couldn't rebuild their house. They couldn't, open up their store or their company that had closed, but they could show up at these planning meetings. They could, talk about their hopes and dreams for the city. They could participate in the recovery of the city just by showing up. And I think that when we came into this process, we were much more interested in the outcome being the plan that was going to unleash federal dollars that could flow for the rebuilding, and all of that happened. But it was the planning process itself that did the most good. And it's interesting now, if you go to New Orleans and you speak to people, you can find folks who, may or may not have graduated from high school and, may have been homemakers or worked in the tourist industry, but they all know the planning terminology. They talk base flood elevation, they talk zoning, they talk all of the terminology that these planners who came in from all over the country, because so many of these folks participated, a lot of them initially, in planning processes that college students came down and ran in neighborhoods, and then the planning process of the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, and then some of the planning events held by the City Council, and then later the Unified New Orleans Plan. And I think because of this, I think this process that was really driven by philanthropy, although mandated by the federal government, because of this, you have a much more engaged citizenry in New Orleans that is going to be involved with the recovery for years to come.
Can I make a quick?
Yeah, please. And also I'd like to ask if there are questions or things that people would like me to.
I was fortunate to take 2 trips down to New Orleans in those early months, and Cerna, when we were there, actually made a nice, sizable grant that our board moved on very, very quickly, which is not very common for most foundations, and it certainly wasn't common for ours. But they moved, and it was a good thing. The thing I wanted to add, my recollection, and you can find it strong, was the overlay of all of this stuff going on was kind of like there's chaos here. And it wasn't chaos with, well, of course there was violence and shootings and stuff like that, but neighborhoods were doing their own planning because they brought in their own folks. The city council hated the mayor. So the city council said, well, we're going to do our plan, and that's the plan because we're the elected representatives of the city. So they brought in a whole other raft of planners. The mayor, of course, couldn't sit still for that. I forgot which one came first, but Mayor Nagin said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm the mayor, and I control the city planning or whatever. So the mayor got deeply involved in his own planning activity, and then there was the philanthropy side that wanted to do it in a different way. And what you had, at least in my take of what was going on, and we spent the day meeting with all these planners, you remember, and I'm sure you remember well, was what is going on here? It's like bees around the honey, and they just kept on coming and coming, and we'll do this plan, we'll do this plan. And you can imagine if you were a displaced individual or someone looking for some kind of assistance or a sense of organization and reality and process, you couldn't find it anywhere. And that, I think, led to tremendous fear on the part of lots of people, and it amplified with the idea that lots of folks were spinning about, well, we have to shrink the city anyway, which was that gray cloud hanging over everything that half the city is never going to get rebuilt anyway. So you've got folks talking about plans all over the place, but the undercurrent was, but half the city is going to die. And in that kind of a, I don't know, hot box, you just can't get stable. Your legs won't hold. And the remarkable thing in this case, I think, was that Rockefeller chose you and a few people chose to, keep pushing the issue of community engagement. That has to be, and for a very uncommon moment, many people in the community stepped up. You also had the school system, which had fallen apart. Nobody was going to school. Federal checks were not coming in, so no one knew not just rebuilding, but Social Security checks didn't come, welfare checks didn't come. There was no economic base for anything to happen, and you couldn't get a building permit for anything. So I'm trying to sort of give you at least my sense of what it was, which Carey lived with and lived through. And if Bosnia was in rough shape, I mean, this place was in incredibly rough shape. and with a few massive egos like the mayor and the governor and everybody else throwing themselves in. And Moon Landrieu, who was the great mayor in the 60s in New Orleans, son was the deputy governor, assistant, what is it?
Lieutenant governor.
Right. And so he was poking around because he wanted his next step up. And it was just so chaotic. And the feeling was, you can't trust anybody, to me anyway. There's no way that you could work your way through it. And the process that happened in a kind of organic fashion ultimately worked its way through it. It's not finished, there's lots to go, but I mean, that was my take. Is it mostly right, or the context of it?
Yeah, no, I think it's entirely right, and I think that it was a very difficult environment for folks who in philanthropy who I wanted the letter of inquiry, and I wanted my 90 days to review it, and then I wanted a 5-page proposal, and I wanted my 60 days to review that. And this is sort of how philanthropy operates, and particularly having come from a national foundation, the Certain Foundation, where the world is your oyster and you're able to pick and choose from among the best organizations in the country, and cities that are functioning like Swiss watches. Suddenly you're in this place where, to put it in perspective, the entire state of Louisiana used to get its federal CDBG, Community Development Block Grant allocation, which is the big community development chunk that you get, that every state gets by formula every year from the federal government. And the state of Louisiana used to get $30 million a year to do all of the community development work that they did. And they were staffed to disperse this $30 million a year. The Road Home program, the program just for people who wanted to rebuild their houses, was an $8 billion program. So that was going to be run by the state. And so the sort of backflips and the staffing and the attracting people and the looking around and seeing who was there, the gearing up for this enormous effort. And the bulk, we're talking about philanthropy today, but the bulk of the money really came from the federal government. I mean, that's where disaster and recovery money comes from, through the Stafford Act. The government was in such disarray. The city of New Orleans, right after the storm, the city of New Orleans, as Ed said, no money's coming in. People don't have addresses for checks to be sent to. The water is not drinkable. Toilets don't flush. There isn't a street light in the whole city that works. It is completely chaotic. The various factions of government were all fighting. All of that was true. The mayor needed to balance the books, and he did not have money to pay staff, and he laid off more than 1/3 of his staff. And one of the departments that got hit the hardest was the planning department. They went from a staff of 33 people to a staff of 8 people. And interestingly, and this was something that always deeply bothered me. My father-in-law was a communications professor, and he says the first step in communication is listening. A good communicator is a good listener. And one of the big problems in New Orleans was that the city of New Orleans was not used to getting money. It wasn't used to asking for money. It wasn't used to receiving money. So here you had this, city staff greatly diminished. They did not know how to ask for money to rebuild their planning staff or to bolster or augment their planning staff. And really, I mean, no one's asked the question here, but I always get asked the question when I talk, which is, why was Rockefeller in there anyways? I mean, really, what business does some foundation have running a recovery plan for a city that it's never even really been in before? And I think that's a really good question. And the answer is it has no business at all doing it. If you read, because the city of New Orleans has a charter, and the city of New Orleans knows that it gets hurricanes, and it knows that it has disasters, and the charter addresses this. And in the city charter, it says that in the event of a catastrophic, in the case of a catastrophic event, the Planning Commission and the Planning Department will put together a recovery plan for the city of New Orleans. But this was something that was entirely unenforced and unfunded right after the storm. And because the mayor had been so burned during this Bring New Orleans Back process and the Urban Land Institute and, as everybody refers to, the Green Dot incident, that the mayor stepped back completely, did not, the commission...
Not for the first time.
Not for the first time, and did not, and basically while the recovery plan for the city of New Orleans was going on, the city planning department was coming up with a riverside redevelopment plan that included high-rise condominiums to be placed just south of the French Quarter.
One of the greatest aspirations of the developers for the last 40 years, blocked repeatedly, and now at last on the verge of accomplishment.
So when we jumped into the fray, we actually reached out to the head of the Planning Commission and gave her a seat, begged her, in fact, to take a seat on the advisory committee that would oversee this whole thing. And she did participate, but very reluctantly and never really spoke up about anything, and was very much a passive player. I think for a lot of people in city government who had really, been doing their thing there for a number of years, the attitude was that eventually this will all come down, the money will dry up, all of these people will go away, and we can, get back to normal. In a lot of cases, they're not that far from wrong. In fact, the government money is all being programmed now. Plans are in place, FEMA projects are lined up, money is being spent, repairs are being made. So that process is in place, and a sort of parallel recovery government has been set up that is taking care of all of those functions.
That's a passive voice. Who set it up?
The governor set up the statewide through the appointment of the Louisiana Recovery Authority. The governors of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana each set up their own foundations, and those are kind of winding down now. So the governor was very involved at the state level, and the sort of agencies that actually the bureaucrats who actually did the real work, they were set up within existing agencies, but as separate units within those agencies. So when the work was done, it's like the spaceship. They could sort of detach and go off, and the spaceship would still be going forward. And then at the city level, at the city, the city, after much prodding, set up a recovery authority that was supposed to sort of mirror the one set up after 9/11 in Lower Manhattan. And
As successful as that?
not quite as successful. Interestingly, no, they said they wanted a czar. They wanted a czar. They said, we need a recovery authority, and the recovery authority was something that had the chance to have a real infrastructure and professional staff, but they became obsessed. The mayor and a few of local nonprofits became obsessed with this idea of a recovery czar. And the mayor hired, I ran into the mayor one day and I asked him, have you selected a head of the recovery authority yet? Knowing that he hadn't, but I thought it was a good question. And he said, we're doing an international search. And terrific mayor. And as far as I know, one person who was from out of the country was interviewed. So it was international and hired, and that was Dr. Ed Blakely, who a lot of people know from the New School in New York. And I think he brought a lot to the effort, but the recovery czar was hired. He was given staffing from the city for about 4 or 5 positions, and this was going to be the city recovery agency that was going to handle the whole thing. And Philanthropy stepped in, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, others, and helped him hire another, 14 or 15, and which was very difficult. And I admire these foundations for doing it because, giving money essentially to the city of New Orleans to hire staff people is not something that most foundations are going to do, but that was what was really needed. And I admire the foundations that did it because this was the recovery authority. And we brought Mayor Koch at one point to New Orleans to talk with Mayor Nagin because we felt there were so many similarities between the, between or could be so many similarities and lessons, between the post-riot 1970s New York City and New Orleans. And after spending an evening and a day with the two of them and others, I took Mayor Koch aside and I said, so, what do you think of our mayor? And he said, he's who you've got. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, he's who you've got, you got to work with him. And he, he himself had written this really nice speech, which he tossed out, and he basically gave Mayor Nagin a pep talk in leadership and how to be a mayor. But, I think if you're going to, we don't choose our cities, our disaster cities. They choose us. And, New Orleans, this is what we got, and this is what had to be done. And there's a lot of hold your nose and funding that goes on. And I think that, it's very high risk. You're not, if you're like me, someone who was brought up in a foundation where there's a lot of due diligence and, thinking and struggling, and is this the right choice, and big bang and bang for the buck and bang, bang, bang. You're really uneasy making these grants that we had to make, but we really had to make them, and a lot of them went south.
I was going to ask you, would you be really candid here as to what percentage of the money so far has managed to do the New Orleans thing?
Well, I don't think, and this even includes government money, I don't think that a lot of the money was, through criminal sort of lost. I do think that a lot of it was not effective. I think the money that was given to city government, it paid salaries. The people were there, they worked, they were there every day. I don't know that they were always able to get a lot done. The money that went to the nonprofits, I think a lot of them really did work that they would never have been able to do. I know I made a couple of bad grants. I made a grant to Acorn Housing. They were going to develop 200 units of housing. They had the land, they had the staff, they had the bank, finance, they had the architectural plans, they had the art, and I made a $200,000 grant when I worked at the Greater New Orleans Foundation to them, and there are no houses built. I don't think anybody ran away with the cash. I think salaries were paid and people showed up for work. They just didn't get anything done. And consequently, nothing got built. And, in the city of New Orleans, prior to the storm, the housing production amongst the nonprofits was really low. Habitat for Humanity was one of the largest, nonprofit housing developers, and they were only building 12 houses a year. The redevelopment of the public housing authorities was all done by private developers, and not, the visionary Richard Barron, let me speak about, social equity private developers, the ones, demolition is this day, people are out this, those kind of private developers. And so there are a lot of people in New Orleans who, are going to jail. One of the city council is only 7 members, and one of the city councilmen who I had to work with very closely on a number of occasions is in prison now. And but it was not for a post-Katrina activity. It was a pre-Katrina deal having to do with parking lots. And most, you actually hear, and maybe just not enough time has passed, but you hear even, Bill Jefferson, none of this involves Katrina money. So I don't think that the Katrina money went that way. No, I don't.
I think that's the triumph of faith over experience. There's nothing in the history of New Orleans, no matter who is running, that would suggest, seriously.
Yeah, no.
Who has run it, that would suggest that they haven't stolen half the money when it's over. I know no public projects in New Orleans, starting with my people, running straight through Irish, Italians, black folks, white folks, doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, it's equal opportunity.
It's an utterly corrupt city, like Miami.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Connecticut. And even though, we think we're better than everyone, our governor and then the mayors of 3 of our cities are in prison. And our governor just got out of prison. And that doesn't look too good for our friends.
The reason they're in prison is they're the amateurs.
Right. the New Orleans folks. Well, I have to say, and when I, even though I had owned a home in New Orleans and lived down there, my mom had lived down there, I'm a northerner, and I'm from Connecticut, and I lived in New York for the last 25 years. And I was very concerned about going down there because having worked for a national organization, I had gone to Detroit and said to Detroit, people in Detroit, well, this is very interesting. In Trenton, they have a similar situation and they do it and been told, that's Trenton, this is Detroit. And we don't do it. Maybe that works in Trenton, but this is Detroit. And maybe, that's Detroit, this is Trenton, that's Camden, it's this, it's, all these, cities are so vastly different and could never have anything to learn from each other. And I was just sure that when I got down there, I was going to be called a carpetbagger and everything else. And I mean this in all, no Pollyanna, I mean, in all sincerity. At least to my face, I was never called an outsider or a carpetbagger or anything like that. And the sense I got was that, and people would say it, we don't want the same old, same old. We don't want to do it the way it's always been done. The problem was, they didn't know how to do it differently. And I think they looked to a lot of us outsiders to really deliver that information. The other thing was, everybody talks about during the crisis itself, how it brought the poverty of New Orleans, this sort of underside of Bourbon Street, what to most of the world was Bourbon Street, and carnivals and parades and carnival kings and queens. It shined a light on the poverty and despair there. All of these folks, like myself and others who went down there, we sort of infiltrated the system. And the reason that I think a lot of the folks were waiting for us to get up and go was because they did want it to go back that way. But as long as the rest of us were down there, they really couldn't have it done that way. And so I think, New Orleans is a very interesting place, more so than any other city in the United States. People who are born in New Orleans stay in New Orleans. And so it's been a pond, not a river. Whereas most cities, the neighborhood was Italian, now it's Jamaican, but the Koreans are, cities are rivers, and New Orleans been a pond, and it's been a pond that's where the water's been slowly trickling out, and just, and so this, I think, has been very, the influx of newcomers. New Orleans built its first Spanish-English bilingual school since the storm. Whereas every city in the United States, particularly, down south, was getting Mexican immigrants. Mexican immigrants were choosing not to move to New Orleans. They were moving to the suburbs around New Orleans. The Hondurans who moved there moved to the suburb. New Orleans had been unable to attract immigrants. The jobs are in New Orleans now. The construction jobs are in New Orleans, and immigrants are coming to New Orleans. Right now, it's actually the fastest growing, on a percentage basis, it's the fastest growing city in the country. As the construction jobs die down, that will slow down. The economy in New Orleans is very strong. Unemployment is relatively low. So I think that a lot of the changes that occurred as a result of newcomers coming into town have been good ones, and will hopefully do away with some of that old New Orleans stuff.
Thank you. This has been really interesting, especially for those of us, I'm sure, that don't know very much about what's happened since. You spoke very eloquently about the People's Plan and this kind of inclusive, intentional, deliberative process that took a year and one day, right? which is a circumstance that says we need one of these active dispatch, right? So I'm wondering how you, if there was any tension between the imperative of doing it right, being inclusive, giving people this outlet and feeling like that they own the plan, which requires time and frustration and democracy and all that stuff, and just the sheer urgency of needs to get the rebuilding going. And if there was ever a tension between go slow, go fast, and how you managed it.
That was the whole tension the whole time we were down there. I mean, it's you really put your finger on one of the big problems with recovery work. I moved down there full time 9 months after the storm. There were still cars in the trees. The water in the lower Ninth Ward was still not certified as potable. I mean, most of the streetlights, I mean, it was still, and at that point, billions of dollars had been spent cleaning up the city. So you're constantly struggling with how come stuff isn't happening, this feeling that it should all be happening a lot faster, and at the same time feeling like, oh my God, we're all making these decisions so quickly, how irresponsible are we being? And the folks from that city in Japan where they had the terrible earthquake years early, I'm sorry? Kobe. Kept saying to us, the first 2 years are just spent in cleanup. Don't even try and get a real plan together for the first, this is all a lot, it's slower, it's slower, it's slower. But you have this sense the whole time that you can't work quickly enough. The people from the World Bank said, their advice to us was, get the money on the street as quickly as possible. So, I mean, I don't really have any answer for that. It's a tension that exists. I think you never have a feeling like you're doing it. You never feel secure that you're doing it right. Everything should happen, and also it's sort of, if you're back in your house in the French Quarter or in Uptown or in the Bywater or, the Marigny, and, you're in your house, you're drinking your water, your lights are on, okay, you might be sending your kids to school somewhere. There are a lot of things not back to normal. You have a certain amount of patience. If you're living in a FEMA trailer, which isn't a mobile home, but is a vacation trailer that a family is supposed to spend a weekend in, and you're 8 months or 10 months or a year in that trailer, nothing is happening fast enough for you. So I think it's also very much a matter of perspective.
Kind of follow up on that. It's such a highly democratized planning process. How did you make the hard decisions like those green dots where just you have to convince people in an area that perhaps rebuilding that same way is not going to be feasible or possible? I mean, how do you reconcile the community's desire to kind of go back to what they desired and what they had and the realities of how New Orleans has changed?
Everybody knew throughout this whole planning process that if all we did was come up with a plan that said, New Orleans should be rebuilt as it was, but just a little bit nicer, maybe with fewer big parking lots and more town centers and better, if we had just done that, we knew it would be an illegitimate plan. I mean, the reality is, even 4 years later, there are still 150,000 less or fewer people living in that city. So, but no one was going to come up with a map that showed parts of the city that couldn't be rebuilt. And at that point, it was sort of, the horse was out of the barn because the mayor had already allowed people to, get these building permits, and a building permit costs about $1,300. So it's, not an easy thing to get. I mean, you have to really make the commitment to do it, and that's why, that's why the building permits are so important, and usually signify a serious commitment to rebuild. So, so no one was going to come up with a map that said you couldn't rebuild in certain places. What our planners decided to do, as far as making their recommendations, after going through all these meetings with people, and first of all, seeing where people were actually rebuilding, and getting a sense from people, a few days after the storm, a week after the storm, 2 weeks after the storm, a month after the storm, you still think you can go back and rebuild your home. And it's going to be between you and your insurance agent and your FEMA agent and, the government, and you're going to put together, and all your neighbors are going to come back. Reality kind of kicked in. By the time our plan was going on, it was, 9, 10, 11, 12 months after the storm, and people had been back to their neighborhoods, and you just had to go there at night to get a sense of whether or not your neighborhood was going to come back, because there were no street lights. So if you went to a neighborhood in New Orleans at night, the only illumination came from FEMA trailers and people who were back. And a lot of people who thought they were going to rebuild went out to their neighborhoods and looked around and went, I'm no pioneer. I'm not going to be in the little house in the prairie, Where are people rebuilding? And interestingly, New Orleans had been, the way New Orleans had developed was like a lot of places, it had been a series of little villages. Carrollton was actually a village, and they had eventually, as the city had grown and filled out, become part of New Orleans. So the thinking was, rather than tell people where they shouldn't rebuild, we should tell people where rebuilding is occurring and encourage them to rebuild in certain areas and make it possible for them to rebuild in those areas and to get out of this bad situation, which is a damaged house, which by code they have had to spend at least $10,000 gutting unless they could get a church group to do, and maintain this house. And maybe even continue to pay a mortgage on it or be forced by their insurance company to put their insurance money into paying off the mortgage. So now you have this, house that's completely unlivable. You've spent $10,000 to have it gutted. You've had a mortgage. The mortgage company doesn't want a mortgage on any empty house that you're not living in. That's not what they gave you the money for. So you've had to use whatever other money to pay off that mortgage. So now you've spent all your money, and you own a property free and clear, but it's a gutted shell that you can't rebuild. So as time went on, the kind of reality of people's situation kicked in, and it made it a lot easier for our planners to discuss the reality of rebuilding than it was for the early folks who really just had their ideas and good topographical maps and good planning school information on how cities, how and where we should build cities, knowing what we know now.
What about the basic underlying problem that most of that property does not actually have clearly established lines of ownership?
That was a huge problem and continues to be a huge problem. Louisiana is a property rights state. The Kelo decision and certain changes made in the state legislature sort of bolstered the property rights thing. It also operates under, and I don't know this for a fact, but I mean, this is how it's been explained to me, this sort of Napoleonic law that involves these, you're a lawyer? Who's the lawyer? These rights of succession or something like that. So, basically, if I own a house and I die without a will, the house goes to all of my ancestors in all these equal, so it's.
In Louisiana, yes, definitely your ancestors.
So, I mean, to your, I'm sorry, to my, right. I'm sorry. So it's, so it was just, and the weirdest thing I heard was that in some of these parishes, which are what they call counties in Louisiana, because the illiteracy rates were so high and so many people had French or Spanish surnames, that the spellings were unclear, that the property records were filed phonetically. And so, and a lot of these, my husband ended up running the, what turned out to be the largest housing repair program ever in the history of the United States, and he didn't even have a secretary. And a lot of these offices in these various, rural parishes, they were open on Tuesday from 1 to 3, pre-Katrina and post-Katrina. So one of the big grants that we made when I was at the Greater New Orleans Foundation was for a property records mapping system in the city of New Orleans that could communicate with the property map and information system in the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. It's all, so getting the records updated, getting the records accessible, electronically, and then dealing with these issues, these title issues, has been hugely challenging. And I talked about this $8 billion in road home money, and I recently did a little research because I was so interested in this. The state of Louisiana received 229,417 applications for assistance. Of that group, 151,085 were determined to be eligible for assistance. So they had sustained damage, they'd come up with the right paperwork, so on and so forth. Of that group, 4 years later, only 125,416 people have been able to receive this assistance. And what stymied most people is the fact that they can't prove they own their house. In fact, in New Orleans, they have a term for it that you probably know. They call it a family house. This is a family house, meaning that, grandma owned it, and then, auntie moved in. You're from New Orleans, you said, right? So auntie moved in, to take care of her when she was sick, and then grandma passed, and then, the cousin came in, take care of her. And so this is a house that's not even really supposed to belong to any one person. It's, in the family's thinking, it's owned by the family for the family to use. The road home had a little trouble with that.
Joe?
Talk a little bit more about the Ford Foundation. You started with saying they went in with a fairly clear, crisp mandate. But what happened after the year and a day with respect to the Ford Foundation? What were the sort of tail of that comment? And what has been their approach since? How much were they able to disengage or stay engaged? And talk about that.
Well, that was actually Rockefeller. Yeah. I think Rockefeller is a very interesting case because Rockefeller got in early, top brass went in, they sent me down there and the whole thing, year and a day. But they always planned on leaving New Orleans. And I think they thought that it would probably, I think in their estimate, it was going to be probably a 5 to 7 year engagement. I think now that recovery is for a disaster of this size is probably more like a 10-year engagement, because we're coming up on the midway point in about 8 months, and I think we're about halfway there. So what Rockefeller did was it encouraged a whole bunch of other foundations to get involved. And the way I have to say we did that was after my year, which turned into a year and a half at the Rockefeller Foundation, I remained at the same desk because I was actually housed in the Greater New Orleans Foundation, but I became an employee of the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And I convinced, and this made me a little uncomfortable because I had been really determined not to try and tell people what to do. I was fine telling them when they had to do it by, but I didn't want to tell them what to do. But I had suggested to the executive director of the Greater New Orleans Foundation that the foundation really could benefit from having a fund that would be for the recovery. And if you look at some of the early stuff, when the board was just starting to convene after, people were able to come back into the city, they had talked about a $100 million war chest. And I think if they had acted from day one, they could have easily raised $100 million, because foundation, the Boston, all these foundations from all over the country were just sending in unsolicited checks to them. And I think had they brought somebody on and sent them out there, they could have raised a big stockpile of money. But they didn't. So 2 years later, I had been shifted over there, and it took me months, but I finally convinced the executive director that he should have this fund and hire dedicated staff, and I could staff it for a while, but it could be the Community Revitalization Fund, which wasn't a really original name, but it had worked for us before. And so a colleague and I worked with the executive director, and we raised close to $25 million. Rockefeller played, my boss, former boss from Rockefeller, played a key role in that. I mean, he dialed for dollars, and he called up all these different foundations, and together we were able to create this $25 million fund, and the funders meet 3 times a year, fall, winter, and Jazz Fest. And they a 2-day meeting, get together, and it's pass-through funding essentially. Rockefeller probably invested another $3 or $4 million after I left, and now it's Gates, Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation is still in, and I think that. I have tremendous admiration for the foundations that went into this world that I think Ed did a great job describing, because it just is not a world that we typically feel comfortable in. The Ms. Foundation, they told stories about right after the storm, they were taking applications over the telephone. You didn't even have to write an application. You just had to call up, and the program officer would interview you over the phone, and that's how they were getting money out to these nonprofits. And I think that was, it sounds reckless, but I think it was really admirable and the right thing to do. I'm sorry that some of the big foundations didn't stay in there. I think that as far as community development funding, domestically, if you found a more interesting place to do community development work in the United States, I'd be interested to know where that is. Because I think that New Orleans is, really fertile as far as ideas. And I think whereas early on, the city and the nonprofits really needed the foundations, I think now the foundations can benefit as much from their engagement in this mid to late stage recovery as the nonprofits can. But, so that's a long way of saying a lot of them are pulling out.
Which is,
Let's talk about them.
For about 20 minutes. She's from New Orleans. Excuse me, Ed.
please go ahead.
I don't even know what questions to ask.
Oh, okay.
I guess the thing that I keep hearing is when you began saying that plan as a noun or verb. And so I guess someone who, so like in our summer program, the Duke undergrads, they go and they work for all types of organizations, like everything from Providence Community Housing and the St. Bernard Project to like Concordia, which is an urban planning firm.
Yep,
right?
they're the ones who did the plan.
So I understand the plan, but then I also worked at the data center. You know, we produced the New Orleans Index, so I see all the statistics. So like you're saying, oh, well, we said that we wouldn't tell them where to rebuild, but then, you know, the outcome of that is that there's so much blight and there's jack-o'-lantern. There's not one street where there's no home rebuilt. Usually there's at least one home rebuilt on any street in any zip code census tract that, you know, like whatever level you could look at. So like, is that a failure of not saying you shouldn't rebuild here? Like, because now the effect is that there's whole neighborhoods that now you don't know what to do with because there's 3 homes and 25 blighted homes.
Yeah, I really think that that's a result of a failure of leadership, quite honestly. I think that it takes incredible bravery, and this is what I admired really the most in Ed Blakely. I think it takes incredible courage to stand up to your population and say, you're not going to like what I have to tell you. You might dislike it so much you're not even going to reelect me. But, you know, safer, if we're going to rebuild safer, smarter, and stronger, that means that you can't rehab a slab-on-grade house that's 6 feet below sea level. And, you know, the lower Ninth Ward is a great example of a missed opportunity. The lower...
Like relatives have shown that, you mean, talking about equity.
Yeah, well, but it's a great, it's a missed opportunity in that if you look at the lower Ninth Ward was losing population like crazy before the storm. And roughly half of all the properties, all the lots in the lower Ninth Ward had been abandoned. And there is enough room in the lower Ninth Ward for every single person who lived there on the day of the storm. And unfortunately, 600 of them are dead. But for the remaining survivors, for every single one of them to move back to the lower Ninth Ward onto higher ground, because the lower Ninth Ward is hard up against the river, and so of course that's above sea level and it slopes down the further you get away from the river. And had we just, you know, and I say we because I remember when, you know, some of the folks came down from the Bush administration and we were talking about the plan, and one of them went like this to me and took me out into the hallway and said, you got to tell me how to convince the American taxpayer that we should spend all this money rebuilding this city. And you're not getting me there, you know. So, you know, when I say we, I mean we, the American taxpayer, we, the foundation, we, the city, you know. Had we just spent the money that we will eventually end up spending there anyways, and said to people, nope, you can wax poetic all you want, which people in New Orleans do about my stoop and my grandmother and my thing and 6 generations and 42 generations and so on and so forth, but you cannot move back to that block. But you can, and we will pay every last dime for you to move 6 blocks away on higher ground in a brand, you know, or a restored or a up. But our leadership was, you know, afraid to say that. The federal government was afraid to spend the money and say to the American taxpayer, no, we are gonna, you know, that speech that George Bush gave, that great speech on that park, that, you know, we're sticking with it. we're sticking with it, yeah.
Great job, Ronnie.
I mean, the best speech of his career was given in New Orleans.
Great background.
So,
Let me, we're about ready
talk
to
about
close.
survivors. You guys are really.
No, I just want to make one point and then we'll probably break. It seems to me there's an issue everywhere that I can think quickly of during the last hour about closing down and not rebuilding. In New York City, some of us are old enough to remember the story that came out by, it was a right-wing think tank essentially that said, during the 70s, New York is falling apart. We should not rebuild the South Bronx. We should abandon, and they identified places in New York City that should never be rebuilt, too dangerous and so on. And the outcry of people that said, you can't do that, whatever, whatever. Well, the city kept burning for another 10 years, and it's only in the last decade that South Bronx has pretty much come back. It's fully, rented up. So I'm trying to think in my history of places where the statement of you can or you can't populate a place has a positive negative response, and it seems to me whether it's plus or minus, it's always vociferous and frequently taking the underdog's side. So to me, the lower Ninth Ward issue became, how can you treat these poor people who have suffered through a hurricane and now they're going to get thrown out and never come back, and the houses are still good. Of course they're not, but that was the argument. And I have a sense that the national and local press was very involved in pushing that story of those victims of the hurricane have to come back to the lower Ninth, to such an extent that lower Ninth is still a wreck, and it'll be certainly the last one well rebuilt.
But you have to contextualize that against the same. I think a lot of that argument was driven by the fact that you have these two towns that are completely adjacent, right? They're both
Right.
across the canal.
Right.
One's all black and one's all
white.
white. And no one ever talked about not rebuilding Chalmette. So I think that,
I agree.
like, if you contextualize it, it's like either we don't need to rebuild any of this,
Right.
or you have to rebuild all of it. And,
Right.
and so I think that's where people told certain stories that they wanted to tell and not others.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think that that's the kind of reactions that happen. And some get really vociferous and negative, and some we must come back. And it pours more gasoline on the fire to a point where you get gridlock, and then nothing much happens. But you're the expert.
Well,
How much was Chalmette wiped?
oh,
99%?
oh yeah, no, every Chalmette and in St. Bernard, oh, very, very, very low return rate.
Point being, nobody talks about Chalmette, but of course nothing's happening.
Well, there's a Walmart there.
I mean, but part of population.
Yeah, well, and the cameraman actually did a lot of work down there. But I think that we're back. That whole idea of coming back, the bring New Orleans back, we're back, it became this sort of battle cry. And it became this point of pride to say, we're back. And I can understand that. I think that the notion that everyone was going to, New Orleans was losing population from the 1960s with, desegregation and so forth, and then the oil companies leaving. In 1960, the city of New Orleans had 650,000 people in it. By 2000, there were only 465,000. It was a shrinking city without the hurricane happening. So the idea that after this huge disaster, 100% of the people would come back was just, naive. I don't want to say even naive. It was crazy. I mean, it was preposterous. It just wasn't something that was going to happen. But after the Green Dot disaster, and and after the comments, I mean, that were made, particularly about people who had lived in public housing. God did to the public housing projects what we had tried to do for you. Horrible, horrible, horrible things. People who had spent all their lives in New Orleans basically being told, we finally got rid of you. And, the demographic change for a moment there, right after the storm, New Orleans was a white majority city again. And, suddenly there was there were white mayoral candidates, and who had a shot at.
Thank God the whites voted for the black, so that they can go back in and they voted against the only good guy in the race.
Yeah, and
right-wing whites, you know what happened in that election. Right-wing whites voted against a guy who actually might have had some damn ability to do something.
Right.
With that, because he was a liberal Democrat.
Who was that?
Mayor Nagin, the first time he was elected, only 28% of the people in a city of 67% black people voted for Mayor Nagin. Mayor Nagin was voted in the first time around by. He had been a Republican, but that's. But the second time around, when he was reelected, he had to use this racial fear to propel his campaign, and that's where the comments about Chocolate City came from, and that got a lot of national press, and it's just a source for endless jokes. I mean, fabulous material. But the other thing that was a little bit even more disturbing than that was he had a bumper sticker printed up that said "Our Mayor," and it was very clear what that was about. And it was very, sort of ironic coming from a mayor who had been voted in the first time around by, white people. And so, but, the Mayor Nagin was a very, I mean, when I used to have to spend time with him, I would look at him and he looked like a deer in the headlights. This was somebody who had basically been a PR guy at Entergy, or no, at the telephone company or something like that. And, had sold himself to, affluent whites as a business person who was going to understand, their concerns. Because in New Orleans, white people have the economic power and black people have political power. And Mayor Nagin was going to be the black person who kind of shifted some of that political power back to the white people. And this storm and this whole disaster, was way bigger than most people, people talk about Rudy Giuliani after 9/11. I'd like to see Rudy Giuliani after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, this was a big one, and he was a deer in the headlights, and he just couldn't really do anything right. And he went from being a media darling to someone who is just, slapped around mercilessly in the press. And the man lost his courage, and, decisions about, planning and where you're going to, he retreated, and the market will decide. the market will decide. So he basically abdicated all responsibility, and that's why you have these situations that shouldn't exist where one person is back on this block and two people are back on that block. And I think at this point, we're in a situation now where, you know, reality set in. I mean, I had dinner with a girlfriend who I knew from the Greater New Orleans Foundation. I was there a few weeks ago at her house. I'd never been to her house before. And, you know, she's an African-American woman, lived on this street, the mixed race, mixed income, wonderful, Gentilly, you know, wonderful, wonderful street, you know, wonderful neighborhood. I got there, it was still light out. We had a great meal, a big fire in the backyard.